Hello everyone, my name is Sonakshi Sinha and I work as a manager in the data privacy and legal team at RiskPro India. Today we are going to discuss on the topic grounds of processing personal data. So now before we move to the grounds of processing personal data, let us understand why grounds are important. Now grounds for processing any kind of data is basically a reason that the reason for which we are going to process that data, and something to support that reason is something that we are looking at when we are saying that we are having a lawful ground for processing any kind of personal data under the DPDPA Act. So grounds are basically your reason for processing that personal data, and we should always be having a lawful ground before we process or use any kind of personal data. So in the course of our processing of personal data or using of personal data, we should always define some kind of lawful basis without which we should not be processing any kind of personal data under the DPDPA Act. Now the grounds which are specified under the DPDPA Act are: first, consent. Now this is very well known that we have to obtain consent of the individual who is providing us the data for processing purposes. So under the DPDP Act, you have to take consent of the individual, and that consent should be obtained based on the notice that you provide to the individual. Now notice has to be given to each and every individual from whom you are collecting the personal data. So the privacy notice is something that we will always be having a link of that privacy notice in our all data collection forms, so that we give the notice to the individual wherein we are telling them to read the notice and then give their consent to the processing of the personal data. Now the notice should always be freely should always be in a language which is understandable to the individual. So it should be in a language that individual understands. Second thing, when we are obtaining any kind of consent, we should always obtain consent in a freely manner, in an unambiguous manner. It should not be based on some kind of force or intrusion. So a consent obtaining is something that we will have to do as an exercise before we are going to process any kind of personal data, which is the only ground that we have under the DPDP Act for processing any kind of personal data of the individual. However, we also have a ground called as certain legitimate uses, which is there in the DPDP Act, but that ground can only be used in certain situations, and it is not applicable to all the organization, and it is not applicable in all the situations. So now when it comes to your certain legitimate uses, it is basically these uses are for states and its instrumentalities wherein they want to give any kind of benefit, they want to give any kind of services. So these are the area wherein they can obviously use this ground as a ground for processing the personal data. Secondly, for an organization, for employment purposes, we can use this ground as a ground for processing the personal data. So when we are processing the personal data or for an employment purpose and for the benefit of the employees, this ground is something that we can rely on, and we will not have to take consent in such situations. Next is for any medical emergency. If there's a medical emergency wherein we have to process any kind of personal data, it is okay to not take consent of the individual and rely on the certain legitimate users as a ground for processing that personal data. Now also there are other grounds under the certain legitimate use wherein it is about fulfilling any kind of obligations of the state. It is also if there are any judgment or law judgment for which we have to process the data, then in that case certain legitimate uses can be used as a ground for processing personal data. Now these are the only situations in which we can use the ground of certain legitimate uses as a ground for processing the personal data. Otherwise, in all other situations wherein we want to process the personal data of the individual, it becomes very important for us as an organization to collect consent. And now when we are collecting any kind of consent, it becomes equally important for us to record that consent. Now recording of consent is something that we as an organization have to keep in mind, because in case there is a situation that arises in which the individual says that we have not provided the consent, we should have these records in place to safeguard ourselves as an organization. So it becomes very important that consent should be recorded. First of all, you should always take consent when you want to process any kind of data. You should always give them a exact reason why you want to process that data, and then take consent. You should not hide any kind of purpose while collecting the data, and then you start using the data for some other purpose. That should not be done. So the data should only be used for the purpose for which they have provided. So consent becomes a very important ground for whenever we are going to process any kind of personal data under the DPDP Act. And certain legitimate use based on any situations wherein if it falls under those situations that are permitted under the certain legitimate use under the DPDP Act, then only we will be relying on that ground for processing personal data. Otherwise, for all the processing that you are going to do, all the way that you are going to use the data is only based on the ground of consent under the DPDP Act. So this was a short video wherein I was trying to explain you what all grounds do we have under the DPDP Act, wherein we can using that ground process the personal data. I hope this was a very useful video for you guys. We will always welcome any of the queries that you have with respect to any of our videos or any of the topic under the DPDP Act. So feel free to reach out to us in the comment box, or you can also send us an email using our email ID. Thank you so much for watching this video.